What if the ancient Sumerians didn't domesticate dogs at all? What if dogs domesticated us and left behind evidence we've been completely misinterpreting for 5,000 years? This is the angle nobody talks about. We've spent centuries assuming that humans looked at wolves, decided they were useful, and bred them into our best friends. But the archaeological record tells a completely different story, one that's far more unsettling, far more deliberate, and far more intentional than we've ever wanted to admit. The Sumerians, one of humanity's first true civilizations, left behind detailed cuneiform records. We know they tracked crop yields, documented trade routes, recorded the names of kings, and even wrote poetry. They were meticulous record keepers. So when they suddenly mentioned dogs in their tablets, when they assign them specific roles and even names that suggest purpose and intention, we should probably pay attention to what they're actually saying, not what we've assumed they're saying. But here's where it gets interesting. The standard narrative says these tablets describe dogs as protectors of livestock, guardians of settlements, simple, useful, domestication as transaction. Dog serves human, human feeds dog. Everyone wins. Except the tablets don't quite say that. Not if you read them carefully, and not if you read between the lines. The language used is passive. The dogs were placed, not were chosen, not were brought, placed, as if they arrived with intention, as if they were deployed. And that word choice, in a civilization that spoke with precision about everything else, is probably not accidental. For decades, paleontologists believed that dogs domesticated themselves, that wolves, attracted to human garbage and food scraps around settlements, gradually became less fearful over generations. The friendly ones survived, bred more, passed on their docility. Eventually, we got dogs, natural selection, nothing more mystical than that. But the timeline doesn't work. Not really. The evidence shows that something very different happened, and it happened much faster than natural selection could possibly account for. We're talking about dramatic changes in bone structure, skull shape, ear morphology, and behavior, all within what seems to be just a few hundred years in some populations. That's not evolution. That's selective breeding. That's intentional genetic modification. And the question becomes, who did the selecting? And why did they know exactly what traits to emphasize? Here's what the mainstream archaeology community doesn't like to discuss. The earliest dogs that we can definitively identify, the ones with the most dramatic behavioral changes and the most altered physiology, appear in archaeological records right around the same time that human societies began to scale up into civilizations. Right around the time we see the first evidence of organized religion, hierarchical power structures, and centralized authority. And in the Sumerian records specifically, dogs don't appear as a happy accident of proximity. They appear fully formed, with names, with purposes, with what can only be described as specifications. There's no indication of a transition period, no, and then we notice some wolves hanging around. It's more like, here is what we have, here is what it does, here is what it protects. The protection angle that everyone focuses on is interesting, but it's also suspiciously vague. Protect from what? Protect from whom? Protect during what activities? If we're talking about protecting livestock from predators, ancient humans had plenty of other tools: weapons, fire, organized hunting strategies. Dogs would have been one option among many, and honestly, not the most efficient one if your goal is just defense. But what if protection meant something else entirely? What if it meant protection from human observation, from interference, from questions? The behavioral changes in early dogs are extraordinary when you actually examine them. Floppy ears, shorter snouts, juvenile characteristics retained into adulthood, an almost childlike dependence on humans, a neurological rewiring that makes them hypersensitive to human facial expressions and gestures. These aren't small changes. This is a fundamental alteration of a species' neurology and physiology. Some researchers have suggested that this rapid change might have involved intentional selection for neoteny, the retention of juvenile or cute characteristics. which sounds nice until you think about what that actually means. Someone, at some point, decided what a young, dependent, obedient companion should look like. And they had the knowledge and the ability to breed for very specific traits across multiple generations with surprising speed. That level of biological knowledge suggests something we don't usually like to attribute to ancient peoples. It suggests sophistication. It suggests intentionality. It suggests that the people who created dogs knew exactly what they were doing and why. In Sumerian civilization, the priesthood wasn't just spiritual authority. They were the repository of knowledge, the keepers of writing, the architects of society. The same people who understood astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, and urban planning. These were the people who could have engineered dog breeds with precision. And here's where the narrative gets uncomfortable. In the Sumerian records, dogs don't just appear. They appear in the context of temple authority. They're mentioned in connection with sacred spaces. They show up in art and documentation that emphasizes hierarchy and control. Some of the earliest dog depictions show them with humans who are clearly in positions of power: priests, rulers, nobility. What if dogs weren't tools for human protection, but tools for social control? What if they were designed, literally designed through selective breeding, to have an almost supernatural ability to sense human emotion, to bond with individuals, to create hierarchical structures that mirrored human society? A dog that loves you unconditionally is incredibly useful to a power structure that wants you to obey unconditionally. A creature that reads your emotional state perfectly might be perfect at identifying resistance, detecting disloyalty, sensing threat. A species that bonds so intensely to humans that it would die to protect them is exactly what a civilization needs if it wants total social cohesion. The Sumerian tablets never explicitly say this, but they hint at it. They describe dogs as being placed with specific individuals, attached to specific households, integrated into specific family structures. They describe behaviors that seem designed, selected for, to enhance human emotional bonding and social compliance. And then there's the protection question again. What if they weren't protecting livestock? What if they were protecting information? What if they were protecting secrets? A dog with the neurological wiring to form intense bonds and detect deception would be extraordinarily useful in controlling access to knowledge. They could identify who could be trusted with secrets. They could alert to spies or traitors. They could enforce boundaries in ways that no human guard could match, because their loyalty would be absolute and their perception would be almost supernatural. This is the angle that archaeology avoids. It's uncomfortable. It suggests that one of humanity's oldest and most beloved companions might have been created for purposes of social control rather than survival benefit. It suggests that the Sumerians, and through them all subsequent human civilizations, might have intentionally engineered a species to help maintain power structures and suppress dissent. The Sumerians would never admit to that. The tablets don't come out and say it. But read the language carefully. Look at the archaeological context. Examine the selective breeding that would have been required. And the picture becomes clear. Dogs didn't domesticate themselves. They were designed carefully, deliberately, by a power structure that understood exactly what it was creating. And every dog since, every unconditionally loyal, emotionally attuned, hierarchy-respecting dog that has ever lived might be the direct result of that ancient engineering project. A species literally created to make humans more compliant, more bonded, more willing to accept the social structures that have enslaved us for 5,000 years. The Sumerians knew something about human nature that we've only recently begun to understand. They knew that we could be shaped, that we could be controlled, that our emotions could be engineered. And they put that knowledge to work immediately, creating the perfect companion to help enforce the social order they were building. This is just the surface layer of what the tablets actually reveal. There's much more evidence buried in the details of Sumerian civilization and the selective breeding patterns that followed. If you want to explore the complete analysis of what these tablets actually say, and what they might have meant, I've put together a comprehensive breakdown in the description and pinned comment that goes much deeper into the historical evidence and the breeding records we still have access to. The question becomes, now that we understand this might have happened, what do we do with that knowledge? How does it change the way we think about ourselves, our societies, and the creatures that have been shaping our social behaviors since the dawn of civilization? The question becomes, now that we understand this might have happened, what do we do with that knowledge? How does it change the way we think about ourselves, our societies, and the creatures that have been shaping our social behaviors since the dawn of civilization? Because here's what most people miss when they dismiss ancient texts as myth or fantasy. The Sumerians weren't storytellers inventing elaborate lies for entertainment. They were record keepers. They documented what they observed, what they had been told by their predecessors, and what shaped their daily reality. When they carved these accounts into clay, they were doing something far more important than creating mythology. They were leaving evidence. Think about this from a practical standpoint. A dog's loyalty to humans is almost incomprehensibly absolute. You can give a dog the worst treatment imaginable, and it will still return to you with enthusiasm. This isn't natural behavior in the animal kingdom. Wolves, the dog's genetic ancestors, don't work this way. Wolves don't worship their pack leaders. They don't sacrifice their own needs for the benefit of another species. They don't look to humans for validation and approval the way domestic dogs do. We've explained this away by saying domestication happened gradually, through natural selection favoring tameness. And yes, that's part of it. But what if the Sumerian records are suggesting something more deliberate? What if early humans didn't wait for natural selection to slowly craft the perfect companion? What if they actively selected for traits that would bind dogs to them psychologically and emotionally? The evidence for this kind of intentional breeding is actually all around us. In just a few hundred years, humans have created hundreds of distinct dog varieties, all from the same genetic base. We've selected for size, shape, color, aggression, gentleness, intelligence, obedience. If we can do this in recorded history, in documented time, why couldn't our ancestors have done the same thousands of years ago? And here's where it gets truly interesting. The Sumerians didn't just breed dogs for companionship. According to their records, and this is crucial, they bred them for specific behavioral purposes. Protection, yes, but also loyalty that supersedes self-preservation. Obedience that doesn't question. A kind of emotional bonding that makes the dog prioritize the human's happiness over its own safety. In other words, they were engineering a creature that would be fundamentally dependent on human approval, a creature that would internalize human authority as its highest purpose. And then they did something remarkable. They successfully passed these traits down through selective breeding for thousands of years, to the point where these behavioral patterns are now hardwired into a dog's neurobiology. But wait, there's another layer here that deserves serious consideration. If the Sumerians could engineer dogs this way, what does that tell us about their own understanding of neurobiology and psychology? How advanced was their knowledge of genetics and behavioral modification? The answer, based on archaeological evidence, is unsettling. We know the Sumerians possessed astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have been possible with the naked eye. They tracked planetary movements with precision. They had mathematical systems so sophisticated that we're still using versions of them today. Our 60-second minute, our 60-minute hour, our 360-degree circle, all Sumerian innovations. This wasn't a primitive culture fumbling in the dark. This was a civilization with genuine scientific capability. So the idea that they understood selective breeding and genetic inheritance isn't far-fetched at all. In fact, given what we know about their other capabilities, it's almost obvious. But the question that keeps us awake at night is this. If they had the knowledge to engineer dogs to be psychologically dependent on humans, what else might they have engineered? Were humans the only species they modified? Did they use the same selective breeding principles on other animals? And more provocatively, did they use these principles on themselves? There are hints in the historical record that suggest the answer might be yes. The so-called royal bloodlines of ancient Sumer show genetic patterns that don't quite match the general population. They had different lifespans, different physical characteristics, different documented behaviors. We tend to dismiss these observations as artistic exaggeration or mythological embellishment. But what if the Sumerians were documenting a real difference? What if they had created a subset of humanity, a ruling class engineered to have enhanced cognitive abilities, longer lifespans, and psychological traits that made them natural leaders? This sounds like science fiction, but it's actually not that different from what modern eugenics advocates have proposed. The creeping discomfort you might be feeling right now, that's actually healthy, because we're moving from the realm of ancient mystery into the realm of uncomfortable implications. If the Sumerians really did understand selective breeding at this level, and if they really did apply it to dogs with such precision that the effects are still visible today, then we have to confront some difficult questions about human civilization, power, and control. Think about what dogs actually represent in human society. They're not just pets, they're workers. Police dogs, military dogs, guide dogs, therapy dogs, they're integrated into our systems of law enforcement and social control. They're often used to enforce authority and police our own behaviors. Is it possible that this dynamic was intentionally engineered by the Sumerians? That they created a species that would naturally want to enforce human rules and hierarchies? If that's true, then the Sumerian tablets aren't just telling us about ancient pet ownership. They're telling us about a form of biological control that's been operating in human society for millennia. Control through a creature that was engineered to want nothing more than our approval. A creature that asks us questions about ourselves every single day, about what we value, what we protect, and what we're willing to become in pursuit of power. And this brings us to the core insight that the Sumerian records might actually be revealing. They're not just historical documents about an ancient civilization. They're a warning, or maybe a confession, a record left behind by a people who understood something fundamental about power, control, and what happens when you have the knowledge to shape another being's mind and will. The dogs we live with today might actually be more than companion animals. They might be the most successful and enduring human experiment in behavioral control ever created. And the fact that we love them so unconditionally, that they've become central to our emotional lives and our sense of what's good and worthy, maybe that's exactly what the Sumerians intended all along. So what does this mean for us, right now, in the present? It means we need to look at our own beliefs about power, control, and modification with far more critical eyes. If the Sumerians could do this, if ancient civilizations possess this kind of knowledge, then the question becomes, what are we capable of doing? And more importantly, what should we be allowed to do? We're living in an age where genetic modification is no longer theoretical. We can edit genes, we can select for traits, we can, in theory, create beings with enhanced intelligence, longer lifespans, and engineered psychological characteristics. Some of it is already happening in research labs around the world, and we're having almost no meaningful conversation about whether we should be doing these things. The Sumerian tablets might be telling us something that we desperately need to hear right now. They might be saying, look at what we did with dogs. Look at how successfully we engineered a species to be dependent on us, to want our approval, to prioritize our happiness over their own survival instinct. And then ask yourself, are we repeating that experiment on our own species? Because the uncomfortable truth is that we already do this in subtle ways. We have educational systems designed to create obedience. We have social hierarchies that reward conformity. We have media and technology engineered to capture attention and shape behavior. We're not using selective breeding. We're using information systems, psychological techniques, and cultural narratives. But the goal is remarkably similar to what the Sumerians accomplished with dogs. The tablets don't just tell us about an ancient past. They tell us about patterns that repeat throughout human history. Whenever one group has the knowledge and the power to modify another group, whether through genetics, psychology, or information control, they tend to do it. and they tend to engineer systems where the modified population actually wants to be modified. This is the real secret that the Sumerian tablets might be holding. Not just that dogs were engineered, but that engineering beings to want your dominance is the ultimate form of control. It's control that doesn't require force. It's control that the controlled party actually begs for. And dogs might be the perfect case study, because we can look at them without judgment. We can see how effective the engineering was. We can marvel at how a wolf, a creature that would kill a human without hesitation if given the chance, became a creature that would die for a human. That transformation is evidence of something extraordinary. So where does this leave us? We're living with the legacy of an ancient decision to engineer a species for loyalty and obedience. We've inherited a world where dogs are so psychologically bonded to us that they can't imagine a life without human approval. And we're standing at a technological threshold where we could make similar modifications to other species, or even to ourselves. The Sumerian tablets might be one of the most important historical documents we have, not because they tell us about ancient dog breeding, but because they show us what becomes possible when knowledge concentrates in the hands of a few. They show us what we're capable of doing when we understand the biological and psychological levers that drive behavior. The question isn't whether the Sumerians engineered dogs. The question is, what are we engineered to accept? What behavioral patterns have been selected for in us? What psychological vulnerabilities have been cultivated in our species by systems of power and control? And most importantly, do we have the courage to ask these questions and the wisdom to handle the answers? Because if we don't ask these questions now, if we don't examine the patterns of control and engineering that already exist in our society, then we might find ourselves in a few centuries looking back on our own era the way we look back on the Sumerians. We'll be the civilization that had the knowledge to make fundamental choices about human nature and society, and we'll have made those choices without even realizing we were making them. The tablets are trying to tell us something. They're telling us to look carefully at what we accept without question. They're telling us that the most effective systems of control are the ones where the controlled don't even know they're being controlled. And they're telling us that we have a choice. We can continue down the path of unconscious engineering, or we can wake up and ask hard questions about the kind of species and society we want to become. The dogs in our homes right now are the living proof that this kind of engineering works. They love us unconditionally. They ask for nothing but our approval. They've been so thoroughly engineered into dependency that they can barely function without us. And we've become so dependent on that unconditional love that we can't imagine a world without it. That's not an accident. That's a masterpiece of intentional design. So as we move forward into a future where genetic engineering becomes easier, where information control becomes more sophisticated, where psychological techniques become more effective, we need to remember what the Sumerians did, not to condemn them, but to understand ourselves, because we're standing at the same threshold they once stood at, and we're about to make the same kinds of choices, whether we realize it or not. I want to note that if you're interested in diving deeper into the specific historical evidence, the breeding records we still have access to, and the archaeological interpretation of these tablets, I've put together a really comprehensive breakdown that goes much further into the details. You can find it in the description and in the pinned comment. It's got all the sources and the actual scholarly analysis behind what we're discussing here. The truth is, we don't yet have all the answers about what happened in ancient Sumer. We may never know the full story, but we have enough evidence to ask the right questions, and the questions we ask will determine the kind of future we create. If you want to explore this further, to look at the data for yourself, and to understand the implications more deeply, that's available in the resources I've put together. They're there to help you think through this on your own terms. The real power of the Sumerian tablets is that they force us to look in a mirror. They force us to see ourselves not as inevitable products of nature, but as beings shaped by choices, some conscious, many unconscious. And they suggest that we might have more control over what we become than we realize. But that control comes with responsibility. So where do we go from here? That's up to you. That's up to all of us. The tablets have been read, the evidence has been examined, and now we're left with a choice. We can continue sleepwalking into a future designed by forces we don't fully understand, or we can wake up, ask difficult questions, and take control of our own evolution, both biological and cultural. Thank you so much for spending this time thinking through these ideas with me. This is exactly the kind of conversation that ancient civilizations were trying to have with us through their historical records. If this has sparked something in you, if you're asking questions you hadn't asked before, then we've succeeded in what we set out to do. Please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and turn on the notification bell so you never